In early May 1945, the brief chance to deploy Germany's most advanced late-war submarine design abruptly ended. Inside the westernmost pen of the Elbe II bunker in Hamburg, the crews of 3 heavily armed Type XXI submarines initiated an irreversible sequence. Facing the immediate collapse of their naval infrastructure, they moved under the code word Operation Regenbogen, a plan for widespread scuttling meant to keep late-war submarines out of Allied hands. But the order was soon withdrawn under surrender pressure. And the final days became a blur of conflicting signals and independent decisions. Even so, in ports across northern Germany, crews still carried out sinkings, acting on their own even after the withdrawal. The crews initiated scuttling measures inside the pens, setting charges and opening internal systems to let the river take U-2505, U-3004, and U-3506. The dark river water of the Elbe surged rapidly into the lower pressure hulls. At 1,621 tons of surface displacement each, they carried a scale and complexity that made them dangerous even at rest. They lost their positive buoyancy and settled rapidly onto the bottom of the flooded pen. The remaining submarine crews abandoned the flooded bunker, and the war ended just days later. The vessels were effectively disabled, and while heavy steel still lay below the waterline, what remained inside was already drifting toward an uncertain future of damage, removal, and concealment. The occupying forces inheriting the ruined port of Hamburg recognized that the bunker itself remained a dangerous, contested industrial prize. Their immediate priority was to render the shattered complex unusable and remove any lingering military risk, even if that meant entombing whatever lay inside. The British Royal Engineers took total operational control of the Elbe II complex in late 1945. The bunker itself was a massive industrial fortress originally designed to withstand immense aerial bombardment from heavy bombers. Its overarching roof consisted of heavily reinforced concrete poured in an immense thickness to withstand heavy bombing. To ensure the 3 submarines could never be pumped out and raised, the engineers decided to weaponize the immense weight of the bunker against the vessels trapped inside. On November 11, 1945, demolition teams packed the wrecked structure with captured Luftwaffe ordnance, described as 47 railcar loads of aerial bombs, and prepared the bunker for a single deliberate blast. The detonation tore through the already damaged interior of the bunker and broke the structure's support logic in a single violent moment. Walls and partitions failed, and the roof fractured and came down into the flooded pen. In the collapse, U-3506 took the worst of it, crushed beneath the falling mass, while U-2505 and U-3004 were buried under debris and silt, beyond any quick, safe salvage. What had been open water inside the pen became a jagged field of fractured concrete and rebar, sealing the submarines under a hostile ceiling. And no conventional surface salvage ship could simply steam in and lift the wrecks free. Any recovery now began as demolition, with the broken roof as the real enemy. Whatever secrets the boat still held were not secured in any controlled way. They were trapped inside a collapsing industrial ruin that would resist almost every attempt to reach it. The daily tidal cycles of the Elbe River immediately began to wash heavy silt and urban debris into the dark, submerged voids below the collapsed ceiling. The water level fluctuated with the tides effectively sealing off any remaining temporary air pockets. The total combined mass of the destroyed roof applied continuous and unpredictable downward pressure on the surviving lower pressure hulls. The exact physical condition of the submarines pinned securely beneath the heavy deadfall remained entirely unknown to the surface crews. The structural destruction was so absolute that the entire western pen was simply abandoned to the river. The primary operational question remained regarding what precisely survived under thousands of tons of shattered, impenetrable concrete. For post-war salvage crews, the ruined western pen offered no safe approach. Everything depended on what still hung overhead. Suspended directly over the sunken submarines was an erratic ceiling of shattered reinforced concrete measuring 10 feet in thickness. The demolition forces had successfully broken the structural arches, but they failed to completely sever the embedded steel rebar matrix. This created a lethal deadfall hazard. The massively heavy roof slabs were not resting securely on the riverbed, but hung precariously in the air directly above the flooded void. The physical dynamic of heavily reinforced material fracturing and remaining suspended by exposed steel tension lines created an imminent crush risk for any salvage operation below. The concrete acted as a permanent mechanical guillotine over the dark water. The sheer weight of the fractured ceiling meant that any shift in the wreckage or any attempt to cut the remaining steel could trigger a secondary catastrophic collapse. Despite this extreme structural danger, post-war scarcity still pulled people back toward the trapped hulls. By 1949, the site drew attention less as a clean salvage target and more as a threat. Investigators needed to confirm whether any live torpedoes or dangerous munitions remained. Then, in 1950, recovery work did begin in earnest on the two more accessible boats. The remaining batteries, junkers, compressors, and copper cabling were stripped from U-505 and U-3004, and one of U-3004's diesel engines was also recovered. Later efforts even blasted away sections of the sterns to reach more material, but the work stayed fragmented and hazardous. Never a controlled lift, never a safe dismantling of the roof, only risky extraction in the shadow of a ruin. The abandonment of the 1949 commercial effort cemented environmental denial as the absolute governing regime over the site. The submarines were not protected by legal statutes or historical preservation orders, but purely by the hostile physics of their surrounding cage. The ruined bunker stood as a monument to absolute physical constraint. The deep tidal mud continued to settle around the lower steel pressure hulls, sealing off the outer torpedo doors and lower ballast vents. The remaining exposed steel surfaces were subjected to relentless galvanic corrosion within the brackish water of the harbor. The environment itself became the primary warden of the trapped technology. The total inability to secure the overhead hazard meant that traditional visual inspection and physical recovery were permanently blocked. The commercial salvage industry recognized that the cost and heavy equipment and human lives required to dismantle the bunker roof far outweighed the value of the buried scrap metal. The site fell into total obscurity as the modern port city slowly rebuilt itself around the ruined concrete shell. Decades passed with the flooded Western Pen acting as a black box of lost naval engineering. The surface authorities accepted that the hulls were completely unreachable. If the overarching concrete structure cannot be safely moved or dismantled by heavy industry, how can the remaining vessels ever be accurately mapped or verified? Twice a day, the muddy waters of the Elbe River fell just enough to expose parts of the wrecked pen at low water. By 1985, a small team of researchers and naval historians, including Jacques P. Malman-Schauel, and with Wolfgang Hirschfeld and Walter Klutz, used that low-tide window to confirm what still lay inside Elbe II. This was not heavy salvage and not a miracle technique. It was timing, nerve, and a brief chance to see steel where the tide normally hit it. The historical survey team slipped into the dark water of the bunker exactly at the lowest calculated point of the tidal cycle. Total darkness immediately consumed them as they navigated the narrow and unstable gaps between the broken concrete pillars. The air inside the temporary void was thick with the smell of stagnant harbor mud, rotting debris, and heavily oxidized steel. The broken roof hanging above them stole their vertical clearance and forced the team to crawl slowly over the treacherous debris field. Every physical movement had to be calculated to avoid disturbing the suspended structural hazards directly above them. The thick, toxic mud of the riverbed sucked at their boots and made the sloping surfaces of the wreckage incredibly slick. Deep inside the gloom, their handheld artificial lights finally swept across the unmistakable streamlined shape of a Type XXI submarine. The upper, hydrodynamic casings of U-2505 and U-3004 physically broke the surface of the receding black water. The historians climbed directly onto the slippery steel upper decks of the advanced vessels. They rapidly deployed their camera equipment within the highly confined atmospheric pocket. Taking pictures in this chaotic environment required extreme physical discipline. The photographers could not step back to frame their wide shots because the deep water and the shattered walls immediately boxed them in. The resulting low-tide photographs provided the undeniable visual proof required to definitively verify the survival of the intact boats. By perfectly synchronizing their physical access with the natural tidal flow, they effectively bypassed decades of absolute structural denial. The blinding camera flashes sequentially illuminated the specialized conning towers, the advanced hydrodynamic outer casings, and the integrated anti-aircraft weapon mounts of the revolutionary warships. The historians captured sharp visual records of heavy naval machinery that had not seen a single ray of light in 40 years. This positive knowledge gain was monumental for naval architecture research. The visual survey definitively confirmed that the primary pressure hulls had not been entirely scrapped or dismantled during earlier operations. The core structural integrity of the upper steel tubes remained largely contiguous despite the immense static loads pressing down heavily around them. The team meticulously documented the specific geometric modifications and sensor fairings unique to the late war submarine design. They recorded the exact physical orientation of the twin hulls resting parallel in the thick river silt. As the minutes ticked by, the changing internal currents signaled the end of their strict operational window. The rapidly returning tide forced an immediate and highly disciplined evacuation of the bunker complex before the rising water could permanently seal their only exit path. And the survey team carefully retreated through the flooded maze of concrete with their hard visual evidence secured. With the images secured, they withdrew from the dark cavern. Yet the bunker's hostile physics still dictated what a camera could and could not reach. The bunker's water column set a hard limit. Camera flashes died in suspended silt, and the historian's sight ended at the muddy waterline. Below it, the lower pressure hulls vanished into a toxic anaerobic slurry that packed vents and sealed doors, turning any footing into a trap. In that tight concrete box, even acoustics would have been unreliable, with broken surfaces feeding echoes and false returns. Everything beneath the mudline remained beyond direct measurement. The historians could positively verify the upper casings of U-2505 and U-3004, but the third scuttled vessel presented a massive and impenetrable forensic wall. U-3506 had absorbed the absolute maximum kinetic force of the original catastrophic roof collapse. It rested directly beneath the most concentrated zone of the overhead structural failure. The heavy concrete slabs had not simply pinned this third submarine, but violently crushed its primary heavy steel pressure cylinder. The resulting chaotic geometry of jagged metal and shattered concrete blocks created an absolute physical barrier that blocked all direct lines of sight. No diver could ever fit through the crushed, twisted fractures, and no camera could be threaded past the rusted rebar to light the interior. The violent physical destruction of this third vessel meant its internal condition and the state of its advanced battery propulsion systems were permanently erased from the visual record. Even for the two largely intact submarines, the internal command and engineering spaces remained totally inaccessible. The strict time limits of tidal infiltration meant the historical team only had a matter of minutes to operate before the river inevitably reclaimed the dark bunker. Attempting to force open heavily rusted external pressure hatches to penetrate the flooded interior compartments under those extreme time constraints was a mathematical impossibility. Any diver becoming trapped or disoriented inside a flooded lower deck would have absolutely no possibility of external rescue. The lethal deadfall suspended precariously above the water strictly forbade the introduction of any heavy cutting gear or mechanized hydraulic tools required to forcefully breach the thick pressure hulls. The researchers were entirely restricted to the role of temporary surface observers walking briefly on the roof of an impenetrable iron vault. That harsh reality set the proof ceiling for the entire 1985 expedition. They took all the visual data the site would allow without crossing into unacceptable risk. Everything located strictly below the dense, toxic mudline and everything securely sealed behind the crushed steel bulkheads of the third submarine was officially classified as permanently unverified. The brief archaeological window rapidly closed as the structural condition of the wider bunker complex continued to steadily degrade. The immense static weight of the fractured roof continued to slowly shift and settle over the decades, threatening a final and complete structural collapse into the river. The location was no longer merely a forgotten historical anomaly hidden in the darkness. The heavily deteriorated concrete structure was rapidly transitioning into an unacceptable urban hazard situated directly within a major commercial port. With the concrete cage deteriorating beyond safe stabilization or clearance, surface authorities had to determine how to permanently neutralize the threat hidden below. The intervention threshold for the ruined Western Pen rested on a razor-thin margin between passive neglect and an active urban disaster. By 1995, the German government faced a severe engineering ultimatum regarding the decaying structure. Decades of relentless saltwater corrosion and continuous tidal erosion had severely weakened the surviving steel matrices suspending the shattered roof. The massive concrete slabs were degrading rapidly, and the overall structural integrity of the entire bunker was approaching a critical failure point. Doing nothing guaranteed an uncontrolled and catastrophic collapse of the roof directly into an active commercial port waterway. Conversely, attempting to mechanically dismantle the heavy ceiling with industrial cranes risked triggering the exact same fatal collapse directly onto the demolition crews. The site fundamentally transitioned from an infeasible recovery operation to a mandatory hazard neutralization zone. The historical value of the highly advanced submarines securely trapped inside was officially subordinated to the immediate safety requirements of the modern harbor infrastructure. To solve this lethal geometric puzzle, the engineering authorities authorized a heavy industrial procedure known as risk neutralization entombment. This specific heavy engineering decision dictates that when an unstable and unrecoverable structural hazard cannot be safely dismantled, it must be permanently buried entirely in place. The core mechanical strategy relies on completely eliminating the empty physical voids beneath the hazard. By forcefully injecting thousands of tons of dense aggregate material directly into the flooded cavern, the engineers could artificially support the hanging roof and permanently arrest any further structural movement. The sheer mass of the injected fill would transfer the massive static load of the shattered concrete directly down through the structure and into the solid riverbed. This aggressive operation would permanently stabilize the urban environment while simultaneously denying any future human access to the revolutionary vessels resting in the deep mud. In October of 1995, the final stabilization began at the edge of the Elbe River. Instead of delicate dismantling, authorities chose to fill the voids in place. The sand from the Elbe was brought in by dredging operations and pumped as a heavy slurry into the damaged boxes, rising through the wreckage to support what the fractured roof could no longer safely carry. The physical displacement inside the flooded cavern was absolute. As the heavy aggregate flowed downward into the deep voids, it systematically forced the river water out and began to violently pack itself around the steel pressure hulls of the trapped submarines. The dense sand cascaded over the advanced hydrodynamic casings and settled heavily into the structural recesses of the upper decks. The abrasive material flowed relentlessly into any open pressure hatches, completely choked the narrow interior command corridors, and locked the complex outer torpedo doors firmly into a permanent static position. The steady injection of thousands of tons of solid material slowly buried the jagged metallic remains of the completely crushed third submarine. It densely packed the tight spaces between the twin parallel hulls of the surviving vessels, ensuring that no future hydraulic currents could ever shift their resting angle. The heavy gravel steadily rose through the chaotic debris field day after day. The dense slurry finally crested the upper conning towers of the advanced warships and continued to fill the dark upper atmospheric cavern. The pumping operation only ceased when the tightly packed aggregate physically made contact with the shattered underside of the suspended concrete roof. By completely filling the internal volume of the pen, the engineers ensured the immense weight of the fractured ceiling was safely and permanently supported by the densely packed sand. The lethal threat of a sudden secondary collapse was completely and permanently eliminated from the busy port. The urban hazard was neutralized, but the cost was simple. The 3 boats were buried in place. After that, nothing remained visible at the surface, only a working port above technology sealed in sand. The modern surface of the port presents a profound visual contradiction to the massive historical truth buried below. Where a towering reinforced concrete fortress once dominated the riverbank, the ground has been leveled and absorbed into working harborland. After the infill and later demolition, the last visible remnants were finally covered over, and the site was turned into an ordinary industrial hardstand tied to container operations. Flat, anonymous, and functional. This final layer of urban infrastructure transformed the lethal ruins into an active parking lot for the bustling maritime shipping industry. Every day, heavy commercial trucks and standard civilian vehicles rolled directly across the exact coordinates where the highly advanced warships were scuttled. The tires of modern port traffic rest just yards above the crushed pressure hulls and sealed torpedo tubes of the forgotten vessels. This surreal juxtaposition represents the ultimate conclusion of the site. The historic submarines were not respectfully recovered or painstakingly displayed in a pristine maritime museum. They were simply paved over and permanently converted into the foundational bedrock of a working commercial port. The heavy layer of asphalt acts as an absolute and final seal, locking the wrecks in a permanent state of inaccessibility. The operational narrative of the Elbe II complex represents a distinct partial success in the realm of historical verification. The physical existence and precise structural condition of the upper hulls were definitively proven. The undeniable photographic evidence secured by the historical team confirmed exactly what survived the massive roof collapse. The core survey objectives were completely achieved without ever initiating a catastrophic structural failure or sacrificing human life. However, the corresponding physical recovery of the actual vessels was absolutely denied by the sheer mechanics of the environment. The historians successfully mapped the technological remains, but they could never physically extract the heavy steel from the lethal cage. The subsequent engineering decision to intentionally bury the entire hazard permanently blocked any future archaeological intervention. The three submarines are now firmly entombed beneath dense fill, isolated from the daily wash of tides that once stirred silt through the ruin. That burial likely reduced currents and oxygen exposure around what remained, but it did not freeze time. Long before the final infill, salvage crews had already stripped batteries, copper cabling, compressors, and other high-value components from the more accessible hulls. What still survives inside the buried steel is not a museum-grade capsule. It is an unknown, sealed by sand, recorded only in fragments. The dense aggregate matrix ensures that absolutely no human diver, commercial salvage crew, or unauthorized relic hunter can ever reach the submerged hulls. The location sits inside a secured, customs-controlled port area where access is governed by modern harbor security rather than public curiosity. The buried wrecks of the Elbe II bunker are no longer treated as a salvage puzzle. After the infill and the later demolition work that finally erased the ruins from view, the priority became simple: keep the harbor ground stable and safe for modern operations. That does not mean the site is solved in any historical sense. It means the risk was managed by burying the void, and the boats were left outside the reach of recovery. Questions of lift capacity or overhead shoring were no longer on the table. What remained was a boundary to enforce. The modern port authorities maintain a clear spatial boundary over the site, recognizing the exact location of the buried historical assets, while simultaneously denying any future excavation permits. The three advanced warships represent the absolute peak of 1940s. Naval technology deliberately erased from the ocean and permanently swallowed by the urban landscape. They remain precisely where their engineering crews left them in the final days of the war. Securely crushed beneath the shattered remnants of their own heavily fortified pen, they are permanently integrated into the very foundation of the city. The definitive historical record of their survival relies entirely on the narrow flash of a camera briefly illuminating the dark water before the ruins were lost to the surface world forever.